The night before Thanksgiving, my sister called me with a warning. She said, "Do not come home tomorrow. We have important guests arriving, and your unemployed single mother energy is not the aesthetic we want for this family." I stood in my freezing apartment holding my 5-year-old son Jaden by the hand and swallowed my tears. With my last few dollars, we went to a late-night diner where an elderly couple invited us to share their table. 10 years later, that same couple became our legal family and handed me the keys to an empire. At my wedding, when my sister finally saw who I had become, her knees buckled and my parents' faces drained of all color. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own table because your family refused you a seat. My name is Serena, and I was 25 years old when my own flesh and blood erased me from their lives. I lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Atlanta where the heating barely worked, and the walls were so thin I could hear the traffic outside all night. It was the Wednesday evening before Thanksgiving. The air was bitterly cold, and I was standing in my tiny kitchen stirring a pot of cheap boxed macaroni and cheese for my son Jaden. The phone rang, and I answered it expecting it to be my mother telling me what time I should come over the next day to help cook the turkey and prepare the collard greens. Instead, I heard the sharp, condescending voice of my older sister, Nia. Nia told me in a tone dripping with disgust that I was officially uninvited from the holiday dinner. She was engaged to Preston, a white investment banker whose family came from old Wall Street money. According to Nia, Preston's parents were flying in for the holiday, and she wanted everything to be absolutely flawless. She told me straight to my face that my car leaked oil and would leave stains on her pristine driveway. She said my clothes looked cheap and that having a college dropout single mother sitting at the dinner table would completely ruin the sophisticated image she was trying to project. I felt a hard lump form in my throat. I begged her just a little. I told her I missed our parents and that Jaden had been drawing hand turkeys all week just to show his grandmother. I promised I would park down the street and walk. I promised I would stay in the kitchen and wash dishes out of sight when her future in-laws were around. I just wanted my son to have a family holiday. Before Nia could respond, I heard my mother Vivian grab the phone. If there was anyone more obsessed with optics than my sister, it was my mother. She was a woman who practically lived for her status in the church and her standing in elite African-American social circles like Jack and Jill. Vivian's voice cut through the line like a knife. She told me Nia was absolutely right. She said my apartment probably smelled like dirty diapers and discount store food, and she did not want me bringing that stench into her home. My mother reminded me that they were hosting people of high caliber and that my presence would only invite unwanted questions. She called me a stain on the family legacy. The ultimate irony of her calling me a college dropout was that I had lost my full academic scholarship to a prestigious historically black university because of her. Years ago, when Nia had secretly racked up massive credit card debt, trying to keep up with wealthy friends, my mother had drained my college savings and begged me to take the fall to protect Nia's future. I sacrificed my education to save my sister from ruin, and in return they cast me out the moment I got pregnant and needed them the most. Vivian told me to stay in my lane and have a quiet night at home. She said Jaden was too loud anyway and would just embarrass my father in front of his important friends. Then she hung up the phone, just a sharp, empty click echoing in my ear. I stood frozen in my kitchen listening to the dial tone. Jaden tugged at my sweater, looking up at me with his big brown eyes, asking if it was time to pack his bags to go see Grandma. The innocence in his voice completely broke me. I dropped to my knees on the linoleum floor and pulled him into a tight embrace, burying my face in his small shoulder so he would not see me cry. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself to make my family comfortable, accepting their leftover affection, and convincing myself it was enough. But being told that my son was an embarrassment, that we were not fit to breathe the same air as my sister's wealthy white in-laws, was a level of cruelty I could not comprehend. I wiped my eyes and looked at the cold boxed dinner on the stove. We were not going to sit in this freezing apartment and cry over people who did not want us. I checked my wallet. I had exactly $24 and some loose change to my name. I bundled Jaden up in his thickest winter coat, put on my warmest jacket, and we walked out into the biting November wind. I did not know where we were going, but I knew we needed to be around warmth and light. We walked 3 blocks down the street to a small family-owned diner that stayed open late. It was the only place I could afford that felt somewhat festive. I looked around my tiny living room at the secondhand furniture and the stack of past due bills on the coffee table before we left. My mother and sister were sitting in a $1 million home, planning a feast to impress strangers, while deliberately leaving my son and me to eat scraps in the cold. It was in that exact moment that the last remaining thread of loyalty I held for my blood relatives finally snapped. They did not see me as a human being. They saw me as a liability, a poor relative who had to be hidden in the shadows so their artificial perfection could shine. I took Jaden's hand and promised him we were going to have our own special dinner. The wind howled as we stepped onto the icy sidewalk, but for the first time, I did not feel the chill. A fire had ignited inside my chest. I just did not know yet that the small, unassuming diner we were walking toward was about to introduce me to the real family I had been searching for all my life. The bell above the heavy glass door of the Sterling room chimed, announcing our arrival into a world we clearly did not belong in. I had walked blindly through the freezing wind, pulling Jaden along until we stumbled into the first place with its lights still blazing. It was an upscale bistro, the kind of establishment where the lighting was deliberately dim, the jazz music hummed at the exact right frequency, and the air smelled of roasted garlic and expensive truffles. I immediately realized my mistake. My worn winter coat was damp from the sleet, and Jaden's little sneakers squeaked awkwardly against the pristine marble floor. Every head in the front dining area seemed to turn in unison. The clinking of crystal wine glasses stopped. I tightened my grip on Jaden's hand, feeling the urge to turn around and run back into the freezing night, but his small stomach gave a loud rumble. He was shivering, his lips slightly blue, and I promised him a warm meal. I marched up to the host stand with my chin held high. The manager stood behind the mahogany podium, a tall man in a tailored charcoal suit with a silver name tag that read, Bradley. His eyes slowly panned down from my messy hair to my scuffed boots, his upper lip curling into a barely concealed sneer. He did not offer a greeting. He simply tapped his expensive pen against the reservation book and stared at me. I asked for a table for two. Bradley let out a sharp, breathless laugh, looking around as if checking to see if anyone else was witnessing this joke. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied my face. A spark of recognition flashed in his eyes. He asked if I was Vivian's daughter. Before I could even nod, he smiled a venomous, knowing smile. He said he thought he recognized the resemblance, but noted that I lacked the polish of my mother and my sister Nia. He proudly announced that he was close friends with Preston's family, the Sterlings, and that his restaurant was actually catering their massive Thanksgiving event tomorrow. Nia had apparently been in earlier that week to finalize the menu, and had spent 30 minutes complaining to Bradley about her deadbeat dropout sister, who was threatening to ruin their perfect holiday aesthetic. Hearing a complete stranger recite my family's cruel narrative to my face felt like a physical blow. Bradley did not lower his voice. He wanted the nearby patrons to hear. He wanted to assert his dominance and secure his loyalty to the wealthy Sterling family by humiliating me right there in the lobby. He told me that people like me bring down the class of an establishment like his. He said he would normally throw me out, but since it was the night before a holiday, he would do me a charitable favor. He grabbed 2 stained menus from the bottom of a stack and marched past the beautiful plush leather booths lining the warm fireplace. He did not look back to see if we were following. I pulled Jaden along my cheeks, burning with a fiery heat that contrasted sharply with the freezing temperature outside. Bradley led us to the very back of the restaurant, down a narrow, poorly lit corridor, and stopped at a tiny, wobbly table crammed right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen and the public restrooms. The harsh smell of industrial bleach and raw onions assaulted my nose. Bradley threw the menus onto the damp tabletop. He told me to order quickly, eat quietly, and use the back exit when we were done so we would not disturb the real paying customers in the main dining room. He turned on his heel and strode away before I could utter a single word of protest. I pulled out the chair for Jaden, wiping the sticky residue off the seat with my sleeve. Jaden climbed up, swinging his short legs, his eyes wide and confused. He looked at the swinging kitchen door, then up at me. He asked why the man was so mean. He asked if we were bad people because we had to sit in the timeout corner. My heart shattered into a million pieces. The tears I had successfully held back in my apartment finally betrayed me, slipping down my cheeks in hot, silent streams. I reached across the small table and cupped my son's face, telling him he was the best boy in the entire world, and that some people were just too blind to see it. I picked up the menu, my vision blurring as I looked at the prices. The cheapest item was a bowl of soup for $18. I had exactly $24. I quickly calculated the math in my head, realizing I could only afford 1 bowl of soup and a glass of tap water for Jaden. I would have to sit and watch him eat, my own stomach twisting in hunger. I was preparing to flag down a waiter when a sudden commanding sound echoed through the corridor. Thwack! It was the sound of a heavy silver-tipped walking cane striking the hardwood floor. I looked up, my gaze drawn past the swinging kitchen doors to the entrance of the hallway. An elderly African-American couple stood there, radiating an aura of absolute, undeniable power. The man wore a perfectly tailored three-piece tweed suit, his posture straight and unyielding, his silver hair neatly trimmed. Beside him stood a woman draped in an emerald green cashmere coat that looked softer than clouds, adorned with a simple yet blindingly authentic diamond brooch. They were the epitome of quiet luxury, possessing a type of wealth that did not need to scream to be noticed. The man struck his cane against the floor one more time, and the entire restaurant seemed to fall dead silent. Waiters froze in their tracks. Diners lowered their forks. Bradley, the arrogant manager, came sprinting from the front of the house, his face pale and his posture submissive. He practically bowed as he approached the elderly couple, stammering a greeting and asking how he could assist the esteemed Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery. Elias Montgomery did not look at Bradley. His piercing, intelligent eyes were locked squarely on me and Jaden. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. The heavy scent of rich cedar and expensive cologne washed over the harsh smell of the bleach. Elias finally turned his head slightly to address the trembling manager. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that commanded the space effortlessly. He demanded to know why the manager had seated his daughter and his beloved grandson in a drafty, foul-smelling corridor next to a bathroom. The silence that followed was deafening. I stopped breathing. Jaden looked up at the tall man with wide, fascinated eyes. Bradley's jaw practically unhinged. He stammered, looking frantically between me and Elias, his face turning a blotchy shade of crimson. He tried to explain that I was Vivian's daughter, that there must be some mistake, that he was just following the social protocols he thought the Montgomerys would appreciate. Josephine Montgomery stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She did not raise her voice, but her tone was sharp enough to cut glass. She informed Bradley that his assumptions were as offensive as his hospitality. She stated clearly and firmly that I was their family, and that disrespecting me was a direct insult to the Montgomery name. She demanded that Bradley immediately clear the largest booth by the fireplace in the center of the VIP dining room. Bradley was sweating profusely now. He nodded vigorously, apologizing repeatedly, stumbling over his own feet as he rushed to prepare the best table in the house. The entire power dynamic of the room had been flipped on its head in a matter of seconds. Elias turned his attention back to me. He extended a warm, calloused hand. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my mind racing to comprehend why these powerful strangers were rescuing me from my humiliation. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw no pity. I saw recognition. I saw a silent promise of protection. I reached out and took his hand. He pulled me up from the sticky chair with gentle strength. Josephine smiled warmly at Jaden, offering her hand to him as well. We walked out of that dark, miserable corridor and back into the glowing light of the main dining room. Every patron stared as we were escorted to the premier table by the roaring fire. Bradley pulled my chair out for me, refusing to meet my eyes, his previous arrogance entirely erased by terror. As I sat down in the plush leather booth, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the protective presence of Elias and Josephine, I realized that the narrative my family had written for me was officially over. I just did not know that this dinner was the first step toward building an empire that would eventually crush them all. The waiter placed a steaming bowl of lobster bisque in front of Jaden. My son stared at the creamy soup and the fresh, warm bread with wide eyes, completely forgetting the humiliation we had endured just moments ago in the drafty hallway. I sat across from Elias and Josephine Montgomery, still practically holding my breath. The plush leather of the booth wrapped around us, and the crackling fireplace radiated a heat that finally thawed the numbness in my fingers. Bradley, the manager who had sneered at me earlier, was now hovering nearby like a terrified servant, his hands clasped behind his back, ensuring our water glasses never dropped below halfway. Josephine Montgomery leaned forward. She had the kind of grace that commanded absolute respect without demanding it. She wore no flashy logos, just a simple pearl necklace and a tailored coat that draped perfectly over her shoulders. She smiled at Jaden, telling him to eat as much as he wanted, then turned her deep, perceptive eyes to me. She asked for my name. When I told her it was Serena, she repeated it softly, tasting the syllables, and said it was a name meant for a queen, not a girl shrinking in the shadows. Elias sat next to her, his hands resting on the silver handle of his cane. He did not ask polite, superficial questions. He possessed an intense, calculating energy that made me feel entirely transparent. He asked point blank what a bright young woman and a polite little boy were doing walking the freezing streets of Atlanta on the night before Thanksgiving. He noted that we looked like we were running from something, or someone. I looked down at my hands. A part of me wanted to give them a polite lie. I was so used to protecting my family's image, so conditioned to swallow my own pain, to keep their secrets safe. But the genuine concern in Josephine's eyes and the unwavering strength in Elias's posture broke through my defenses. For the first time in my life, I did not protect the people who had hurt me. I told them everything. I explained how my mother Vivian and my sister Naya were currently sitting in a beautiful suburban home planning a massive dinner for the wealthy Sterling family. I told them about the phone call, the disgust in my sister's voice, and how my mother had explicitly uninvited me because my status as a single mother working odd jobs would ruin their aesthetic. I watched Josephine's face tighten with quiet fury as I recounted how my own mother told me my son was a liability, a stain on their carefully curated social standing. Elias took a slow sip of his sparkling water. He asked how a family could cast out their own flesh and blood over something as trivial as social optics. He asked if there was a deeper resentment, perhaps a failure they blamed me for. That question struck the deepest nerve. My voice trembled as I told him that they called me a failure because I was a college dropout. But the title was a lie. I had not dropped out because I was lazy or unable to handle the coursework. I had been a straight A student on a full academic scholarship at Spelman College, studying business administration. I was on the dean's list. I was building a future. But while I was studying in the library, Nia was living a double life. She had fallen in with a crowd of incredibly wealthy students and developed a severe gambling addiction, trying to maintain a lifestyle she could not afford. She was in deep with some very dangerous people. She owed over $40,000. When the debt collector started making threats, Nia went crying to our mother. Vivian did not punish Nia. Instead, she panicked about the family reputation. She knew that if the church community or her elite social clubs found out about Nia's gambling, their pristine image would be shattered. So without telling me, my mother forged my signature and completely drained the supplemental college savings fund my grandfather had left me. The money that was supposed to pay for my housing, my books, and my living expenses was gone overnight. When I discovered the account was empty, I confronted them. Vivian broke down in tears, begging me to understand. She said Nia was fragile, that a scandal would ruin Nia's chances of marrying into a good family. She demanded that I take a semester off to work and help rebuild the funds. But a semester turned into a year. I lost my housing, I lost my scholarship. I got pregnant shortly after, and the man abandoned me when things got hard. Instead of helping me, my mother and sister spun a completely different narrative. To their friends and our extended family, they sighed and shook their heads, telling everyone that I had gone off the rails. They claimed I was irresponsible, that I chose to get pregnant and drop out of school. They sacrificed my entire future, my reputation, and my stability, just to cover up Nia's mistakes. They stole my life to protect her lie. And tonight they had thrown me out into the cold, because the false version of me that they had created was no longer acceptable for their dinner table. The silence at our VIP booth was profound. Jaden was happily eating his bread, oblivious to the heavy emotional weight settling over the adults. I felt a sudden wave of panic, fearing I had overshared, fearing that these wealthy, sophisticated strangers would judge me for the messy, broken reality of my life. I looked at Elias, expecting to see pity or discomfort. I saw neither. His jaw was set, his eyes dark and sharp as obsidian were locked onto mine. He did not offer empty platitudes or generic sympathy. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The air around him seemed to crackle with an invisible, terrifying power. He said that family is not defined by blood, but by loyalty. He said that people who steal your foundation and then mock you for falling are not your family. They are parasites. He looked around the luxurious dining room, glancing dismissively at Bradley, who was still hovering nervously by the service station. Elias turned his piercing gaze back to me. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted prey, but the prey was not me. The prey was anyone who had ever dared to make me feel small. He asked if my family truly believed I was trash. He asked if they thought my lack of wealth made me entirely disposable. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored tweed jacket and pulled out a thick, embossed business card. He slid it across the damp mahogany table until it rested right in front of me. The card was heavy matte black with silver lettering. He told me to take the card. He told me that tomorrow morning, while my mother and sister were busy impressing their guests with a fake life, I was going to pack a bag and bring my son to the address printed on that card. He said he saw a fire in me, a brilliance that my family had desperately tried to extinguish. He promised that if I listened to him, if I trusted him, my life of shrinking and begging for scraps was permanently over. Elias leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, powerful whisper that sent shivers down my spine. He told me that I was going to learn everything about business, real estate, and power. He looked directly into my eyes and said that he was going to teach me how to buy this exact restaurant, and eventually how to buy the ground my arrogant family walked on. I sat frozen, staring at the silver letters on the black card, the Montgomery Holdings Group. I looked from the card to the elderly couple sitting across from me. They looked like kind grandparents, but they spoke with the authority of kings. I clutched the card in my hand, feeling the sharp, clean edges of the thick paper. A thrilling, dangerous question echoed in my mind. Who were Elias and Josephine Montgomery, and what kind of empire had I just walked into? 5 years later, the answer to that question was staring back at me from the polished glass of my corner office window. The freezing, frightened 25-year-old mother, who had clutched that black business card, was gone. In her place sat a 30-year-old woman who understood the exact weight of power. I leaned over my massive oak desk and pressed the gold nib of my fountain pen against a stack of thick legal documents. I signed my name with a smooth, practiced stroke, finalizing a $40 million commercial real estate acquisition. The Montgomery Holdings Group had not just taken me in. Elias and Josephine had forged me into a weapon. They taught me how to read balance sheets, how to spot weakness in a corporate structure, and most importantly, how to wait for the perfect moment to strike. The quiet hum of the air conditioning was suddenly broken by the sharp vibration of my personal cell phone resting on the desk. I glanced at the screen. The name flashing across the digital display made my hand freeze. It was Nia. We had barely spoken since that bitter Thanksgiving night 5 years ago. To my family, I was still the invisible failure, the college dropout single mother who was likely scrubbing floors or waiting tables to survive. I had strictly forbidden any mention of my name in the Montgomery corporate press releases. The illusion of my poverty was the greatest shield I possessed. I picked up the phone, took a slow, steadying breath, and pressed answer. Serena. I hope I am not interrupting your shift at whatever discount store you are working at these days. Nia's voice poured through the speaker, dripping with that familiar, toxic, syrupy condescension. It was the exact tone she used when she wanted to remind me of my place at the bottom of her world. I kept my voice perfectly flat and replied that I had a minute to spare. Nia did not waste time asking how I was or how Jaden was doing. She went straight into her performance. She proudly announced that Preston had just closed an absolute monster of a deal for his investment firm, a $5 million commercial package that was going to put him on the map. To celebrate their new wealth, she was throwing an extravagant party at their sprawling new suburban mansion this coming Saturday. She listed the high-profile guests she invited, making sure to mention the judges, the local politicians, and the elite socialites who would be walking through her front doors. Then came the real reason for her call. I know things are always tight for you, Nia said, lowering her voice, as if she were sharing a painful secret. And holidays are coming up. Preston and I discussed it, and we want to help you out. You can come to the house on Saturday, but you need to use the service entrance in the back. The catering staff we hired is a little short-handed. If you come quietly through the kitchen and help the staff clear plates, collect the empty champagne glasses, and take out the trash before the guests see you, I will personally hand you $200 in cash. I held the phone away from my ear for a fraction of a second, looking down at the $40 million contract I had just signed. My sister was offering me $200 to be her hidden maid at a party celebrating a $5 million deal. The absolute arrogance of it was staggering. She wanted the psychological thrill of having me under her roof, scrubbing her dirty plates while she paraded around in diamonds. She wanted to physically see my submission. A younger version of me would have screamed at her. The old Serena would have cried, felt the crushing weight of humiliation, and hung up the phone in a fit of rage. But Elias Montgomery had completely rewired my mind. He had spent the last 5 years teaching me that anger is useless unless it is disciplined. I smiled. A cold, sharp smile that did not reach my eyes. That is incredibly generous of you, Nia, I said, injecting just enough manufactured gratitude into my voice to feed her massive ego. $200 would really help Jaden and me right now. I will be at the back door on Saturday. Just tell me what time the catering manager needs me. Nia let out a self-satisfied little laugh, completely oblivious to the trap she had just set for herself. She gave me the arrival time, reminded me again not to linger in the main dining room, and hung up. I set the phone back down on my glass desk and turned my chair to face the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant golden light across the high-rise buildings I now effectively owned. I thought of Elias. I remembered the very first lesson he taught me in his private study when I was still trembling with the trauma of my family's rejection. He had poured me a cup of black tea, looked me dead in the eyes, and delivered a truth that became my daily mantra. Always let your enemies think they are standing right on top of your head. Let them enjoy the view. Let them get entirely comfortable with their false sense of superiority. Because when they are looking down at you, they are never looking at their own feet. And that makes it incredibly easy to reach out and pull the rug completely out from under them. Nia and Preston wanted a maid for their party. They wanted a pathetic prop to make their mediocre success feel grand. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, heavily redacted file with Preston's name on it. I had been keeping tabs on my arrogant brother-in-law. I knew exactly how he financed that $5 million deal, and I knew the dangerous high-interest loans he had taken out to secure his new mansion. I picked up my pen again. I would go to their party. I would walk through the back door. I would clear their dirty plates. I would play the perfect impoverished sister right up until the moment I decided to burn their entire fabricated kingdom to the ground. The heavy oak service door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside the stifling atmosphere of Nia and Preston's suburban fortress. I adjusted the plain black apron the catering manager had shoved into my hands moments earlier. The fabric was stiff, scratchy, and smelled faintly of industrial starch, a sharp contrast to the bespoke silk blouses and tailored blazers I usually wore while commanding the executive boardroom at Montgomery Holdings. But tonight I was playing a carefully constructed role. I picked up a silver tray loaded with empty champagne flutes and pushed my way through the swinging doors into the main ballroom. The visual assault of forced, desperate opulence hit me instantly. Massive crystal chandeliers threw harsh, fracturing light across a sea of sequined gowns and rented tuxedos. A string quartet played in the corner, their delicate music entirely drowned out by the booming, obnoxious laughter of people trying too hard to prove they belonged. Moving silently through the crowd, I became a ghost. People like this never look at the help. They look right through you, their eyes scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. I navigated around clusters of guests, catching fragments of their hollow, vapid conversations. A woman dripping in ostentatious, flashy diamonds complained loudly about the difficulty of finding good domestic staff who knew their proper place. A man in a velvet dinner jacket boasted about evading taxes through offshore shell companies, completely unaware of how small-minded he sounded. It was a symphony of greed, a desperate scramble for validation. I moved effortlessly through the room, my posture straight, my face an impenetrable mask of calm. Near the grand fireplace, I spotted my parents. Vivian and Arthur stood holding court with a local city councilman, laughing with a synchronized, desperate eagerness that made my stomach turn. My mother wore a dress that was slightly too tight and entirely too flashy, trying to blend in with old money, but only succeeding in looking like a caricature of wealth. I walked right past them to collect a discarded cocktail napkin from a side table. My father's eyes brushed over me, registered exactly who I was, and instantly darted away in sheer panic. He shifted his stance physically, turning his back to block me from his view. They were terrified that anyone in this room might realize the woman quietly clearing the trash was their own flesh and blood. I ignored their pathetic display and moved toward the center of the room, guided by the booming, arrogant voice of my brother-in-law. Preston stood on the edge of the sunken living room holding a heavy crystal glass of dark amber scotch. He was surrounded by a captive audience of minor investors and fawning sycophants. Nia stood plastered to his side wearing a dress that cost more than my first car, practically glowing with smug, unearned satisfaction. I approached their circle quietly, balancing my silver tray against my hip, and listened to the brilliant business strategy he was bragging about to his captivated audience. Preston was holding court about his hedge fund's latest acquisition strategy, the very deals that had funded this extravagant mansion. He spoke with the casual callousness of a man playing a board game with real human lives. He boasted loudly about targeting historically black neighborhoods in the southern district of the city, detailing his aggressive buyout tactics used to force generational homeowners out of their properties. He called it urban revitalization, a sterile, sanitized corporate term for stripping families of their heritage and flipping the land for luxury condominiums. He bragged about manipulating local zoning laws, bribing city planners, and suffocating small legacy businesses with sudden rent hikes until the owners had no choice but to sell for pennies on the dollar. He laughed as he described an elderly bakery owner who had cried in his office when he handed her the eviction notice. He took a sip of his scotch, declaring that emotions had no place in real estate, and that the weak were simply meant to pave the way for the strong. The sheer, unfiltered hypocrisy of it made my jaw tighten. Here was a man dismantling my community for sport, erasing decades of history just to line his own pockets, and right beside him stood my own parents, nodding in vigorous, enthusiastic agreement. Vivian actually reached out and patted Preston's arm, her voice dripping with sickening adoration. She told him he was an absolute visionary. She said the family was truly blessed to have a man of his caliber, leading the way into the future. My parents, who had grown up in those exact same neighborhoods, who had relied on those same legacy businesses when times were hard, were actively applauding the man tearing them down. They were selling out their own history, their own people, just so they could sip free champagne in his living room and pretend they were part of the elite. I stepped forward into the edge of their circle to clear a stack of abandoned appetizer plates. My movement caught Nia's eye. Her gaze locked onto my cheap black uniform, the messy bun I had tied my hair into, and the scuffed loafers I had worn specifically for this occasion. A cruel, predatory smile spread across her perfectly painted lips. She nudged Preston with her elbow and pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. The entire circle of wealthy guests stopped talking and turned to stare at the server who had dared to interrupt their brilliant conversation. Nia announced to the crowd, her voice carrying over the music, that her sister had finally decided to make herself useful for once in her life. She told her wealthy friends that it was so important to teach the less fortunate about the value of hard work, especially those who relied on handouts. Preston turned slowly unsteady on his feet from the scotch. A nasty, condescending smirk twisted his features. He looked me up and down, taking in my lack of jewelry, my plain hair, the cheap catering apron. He took a deliberate step right into my personal space. The smell of stale alcohol and arrogant cologne rolled off him in waves. He raised his heavy glass of red wine, maintaining unbroken, mocking eye contact with me. With a deliberate, calculated flick of his wrist, he tipped the crystal goblet forward. The dark crimson liquid cascaded through the air, splashing heavily against my chest and soaking instantly through the thin white fabric of my shirt underneath the apron. The cold wetness clung to my skin, the red stains spreading rapidly across my collar and down my uniform. A collective gasp rippled through the surrounding guests. The string quartet seemed to falter for a fraction of a second. My mother took a sharp step back, raising a hand to her mouth, not in defense of me, but in utter horror at the scene disrupting her perfect evening. Nia just laughed. It was a high, piercing sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. She was reveling in my absolute humiliation. Preston did not even bother to pretend it was an accident. He swirled the remaining drops in his glass, letting out a short, barking laugh. He looked at the massive red stains spreading across my shirt and offered a completely hollow, dripping apology. He said he was terribly sorry, but noted that it was perfectly fine, since that cheap shirt was probably bought at a local thrift store anyway. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my face, and suggested I use the $200 Nia was paying me tonight to buy something that did not look like literal garbage. I did not flinch. I did not drop my tray. I did not let a single tear form in my eyes. I stood perfectly still, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out across the room. The old Serena, the broken girl from 10 years ago, would have shattered under the weight of this public degradation. She would have run crying through the back door, confirming their belief that she was weak and worthless. But the woman standing in their living room was a ghost they could not comprehend. I was the architect of their impending ruin. I looked directly into Preston's bloodshot, arrogant eyes. I saw the pathetic weakness behind his bluster, the desperate need to demean others to inflate his own fragile, over-leveraged ego. He thought he was a king celebrating a $5 million victory, completely unaware that he was staring at a woman who moved $40 million before her morning coffee. I slowly reached into my apron pocket, pulled out a clean white cocktail napkin, and calmly dabbed a single drop of wine from my collar. I maintained an unnerving, icy composure that seemed to cause a flicker of confusion to pass behind Preston's eyes. I did not shout. I did not defend myself. I just offered him a slight, knowing smile. A smile that held all the secrets of his overextended credit lines, his failing shell companies, and the massive debt he was drowning in. I turned on my heel and walked calmly back toward the kitchen doors, my spine straight and my head held high. I left them standing there in their beautiful, fragile house of cards, blissfully unaware that I was already holding the match. The heavy swinging doors of the catering kitchen closed behind me, cutting off the chaotic noise of the ballroom. I did not rush to the staff bathroom to scrub the wine stain. I simply removed the soiled black apron, folded it neatly, and tossed it into a laundry bin. I grabbed a fresh, crisp apron from the catering manager's reserve stack and tied it securely around my waist. The manager, a frantic woman named Carla, holding a clipboard and a walkie-talkie, did not even register the wardrobe change. She just pointed a shaking finger toward the west wing of the mansion, instructing me to clear the VIP lounge and the private study before the guests migrated. I picked up a fresh silver tray and stepped back into the lavish corridors. The camera of my own mind shifted, dropping low to track my sensible black loafers, moving silently against the imported Turkish marble. I was a phantom navigating the arteries of a house built entirely on arrogance and deceit. The contrast between my servant uniform and the sheer absolute power I held was a secret symphony playing only in my head. Before I could reach the heavy oak doors of the west wing, a sharp, desperate hand clamped down on my forearm. I stopped and turned my head slowly. It was my mother. Vivian dragged me roughly into a darkened alcove near the coat check, her face pinched with a furious, panicked energy. The heavy scent of her expensive floral perfume was suffocating. She kept her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper, terrified that one of Nia's high society friends might overhear us. She hissed that I was a complete embarrassment. She accused me of intentionally provoking Preston of standing too close to the center of the room, just to ruin Nia's perfect evening. She demanded to know why I could not just disappear into the background like I was supposed to. She ordered me to stay out of sight for the rest of the night or leave entirely without the $200 I supposedly desperately needed. 10 years ago, that grip on my arm would have broken my spirit. 10 years ago, her words would have sent me running into the cold night, convinced that I was exactly the worthless burden she claimed I was. But Elias Montgomery had not just taught me how to read balance sheets. He had taught me how to read people. Looking at my mother now, I did not see a powerful matriarch. I saw a terrified, hollow woman who had sold her soul to maintain the illusion of relevance. I looked down at her manicured hand gripping my arm. I did not raise my voice. I did not pull away. I simply looked directly into her eyes and told her to let go of me. The quiet, absolute authority in my voice, a tone she had never once heard from her scapegoat daughter, sent a shockwave through her body. She instantly released her grip, stepping back, as if she had touched a live wire. Her eyes darted across my face, searching for the timid girl she used to bully, and finding a wall of cold, impenetrable stone. I smoothed the sleeve of my shirt calmly. I told her that the wine stains from this evening would easily wash out, but the stains on her conscience never would. I told her to go back to her party and enjoy the champagne while it lasted. I stepped out of the alcove, leaving her standing there entirely speechless, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. I did not look back. I resumed my steady, purposeful stride down the corridor until I reached the heavy double doors of Preston's private study. I turned the brass handle and slipped inside, letting the door click shut behind me. The study was a monument to Preston's massive, fragile ego. It was decorated in dark mahogany and forest green leather, designed to look like the office of a seasoned titan of industry. Shelves were lined with pristine leather-bound books that had clearly never been opened. A display case held a collection of expensive imported cigars. The entire room smelled of artificial leather and unearned confidence. I walked toward the seating area, collecting 2 discarded whiskey glasses and placing them on my silver tray. My eyes drifted to the massive executive desk in the center of the room. Preston was so arrogant, so convinced of his own untouchable superiority, that he had not even bothered to lock his private financial documents away during a party with over 100 guests in his home. He assumed that the catering staff, the invisible people moving through his house, lacked the intelligence to understand what was sitting right out in the open. I walked behind the desk, pulling a microfiber cloth from my apron to wipe down the polished wood. My eyes scanned the thick stack of papers left carelessly scattered beside a gold-plated pen. As I read the bold headers at the top of the pages, my hands stilled. I recalled my grueling, relentless training with Elias Montgomery. 5 years of dissecting complex corporate structures, identifying predatory lending practices, and learning exactly how desperate men hide their failing margins behind layers of corporate jargon. I had spent countless hours in the Montgomery Holdings boardroom, analyzing the life cycles of toxic debt. Preston's hedge fund was not thriving. It was hemorrhaging cash at a catastrophic rate. The $5 million commercial real estate deal he had just been bragging about to his captivated audience in the ballroom was not bought with profits or secure investor capital. It was heavily leveraged with toxic high-yield bridge loans. He had used this very mansion, this sprawling suburban fortress, as collateral to secure the funding. He was playing a dangerous, reckless game of financial roulette, betting everything he had on a commercial flip that was already underwater. I carefully moved a secondary file folder aside, exposing the master loan agreement underneath. I leaned in closer, my eyes tracking the origination header printed in stark black ink. Apex Vanguard Capital. My breath caught in my throat. It was not out of fear or anxiety, it was the sheer intoxicating thrill of absolute, undeniable victory. The universe had a wicked, brilliant sense of humor. Apex Vanguard Capital was not just some anonymous, aggressive lending firm operating out of a high-rise in Chicago. It was a Tier 3 shadow subsidiary, entirely owned and operated by the Montgomery Holdings Group. Elias had acquired the firm 2 years ago to handle high-risk, high-yield corporate debt portfolios. And because I had proven my ruthlessness in corporate restructuring, Elias had placed me directly on the executive oversight board of that exact subsidiary. I was the primary signatory for their largest accounts. I scanned the terms of the contract Preston had signed. They were brutal. An exorbitant 22% interest rate with a strict, non-negotiable default clause. If Preston missed a single quarterly payment by even 24 hours, the lender had the immediate legal right to seize the collateral. The collateral was his firm, his commercial acquisitions, and the very house his guests were currently partying in. Preston had effectively borrowed millions of dollars to fund his arrogant lifestyle from the very woman he had just publicly humiliated. He was drowning in debt, and I owned the water. I pulled my personal cell phone from the deep pocket of my trousers. The screen cast a pale blue glow in the dim light of the study. I bypassed the lock screen and opened the camera app. I held the phone steady above the desk, ensuring the lighting was perfect. I snapped a crystal-clear, high-resolution photograph of the signature page capturing Preston's arrogant, sprawling signature right next to the draconian terms of the Apex Vanguard Capital loan. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and picked up my silver tray. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face, warming the cold detachment I had carried all evening. Elias Montgomery's voice echoed clearly in my mind. Let the enemy think they are standing right on top of your head until the exact moment you rip the floorboards out from under them. Preston and Nia thought they had invited a pathetic broken maid into their home to scrub their floors. They had no idea they had just invited their executioner into their private sanctuary. I turned around and walked out of the study, ready to serve them the rest of their perfect evening. They had exactly 30 days until their first payment was due. The countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun. I stepped off the pristine cobblestone driveway of Preston's mansion and into the cool night air. The heavy bass of the party music faded into a dull thud behind me. I pulled the keys to my modest sedan from my pocket, feeling a dangerous, thrilling sense of victory coursing through my veins. I had the exact weapon I needed to destroy the people who had made my life a living hell. But the universe has a cruel way of balancing the scales. Just as I unlocked my car door, my cell phone vibrated violently against my thigh. I assumed it was my mother calling to berate me for leaving without collecting my degrading $200 payment. I pulled the device from my pocket, ready to ignore it, but the caller ID made my blood run cold. It was Marcus, the head of executive security for the Montgomery family. Marcus never called my personal line, unless it was a matter of absolute corporate urgency. I answered the phone. Marcus did not offer a greeting. His normally booming, steady voice was fractured and breathless. He told me there had been a catastrophic accident on the interstate. A drunk driver had crossed the median and struck Elias and Josephine's town car head-on. He told me to get to Atlanta General Hospital immediately. The drive to the hospital was a blur of flashing traffic lights and blinding panic. The cold, calculating strategist, who had just stood in Preston's study, vanished entirely, replaced by a terrified daughter, desperate to reach the only real parents she had ever known. I sprinted through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, my cheap catering shoes slipping on the polished linoleum. Marcus met me near the surgical wing, his face ashen and drawn. He did not have to speak. I saw the absolute devastation in his eyes. Josephine had been killed on impact. The air was sucked completely out of my lungs. I braced myself against the harsh white wall of the corridor, trying to process the impossibility of the statement. Josephine, the woman who had taught me how to walk into a boardroom and command respect without raising my voice, was gone. Marcus placed a heavy hand on my shoulder and guided me toward the intensive care unit. He told me Elias had survived the initial crash, but the internal bleeding was severe. The surgeons had done everything they could, but his heart was failing. He was holding on by a thread, and he was asking for me. I walked into the dimly lit hospital room, the rhythmic, sterile beeping of the heart monitor amplifying the dread in my chest. Elias looked impossibly small in the hospital bed. The towering, unyielding titan of industry, who had rescued me from a dark restaurant corridor 5 years ago, was fading. I rushed to his side, taking his frail, calloused hand in mine. Tears spilled down my cheeks, ruining the mask of composure I had worn all evening. Elias slowly turned his head, his dark eyes finding mine. Even now, shadowed by pain, his gaze possessed that same piercing, intelligent fire. He squeezed my fingers weakly. He did not waste his final breaths on fear or regret. He spoke with the quiet, absolute certainty of a king securing his legacy. He told me not to cry. He reminded me that tears were a luxury we could not afford when there was an empire to run. He coughed, his breath rattling in his chest, and pulled me closer. He confessed a truth that he and Josephine had kept closely guarded from the world. They had never been able to have biological children. The sprawling corporate dynasty they had built, the endless portfolio of real estate and shadow subsidiaries, had no blood heir. Elias looked at me, his eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering pride. He said they had spent decades looking for someone who possessed the exact combination of intellect, ruthlessness, and pure, unbreakable grit required to inherit the Montgomery name. He told me they had found it the moment they saw me comforting my son in the shadows of that bistro. He told me that 2 months ago he and Josephine had finalized the legal paperwork. They had formally and legally adopted me. I was not just their protege. I was their daughter. I was the sole heir to everything they had built. Elias whispered his final command, telling me to take the throne, to protect Jaden, and to show no mercy to those who stood in my way. The heart monitor let out a long, continuous tone, and the brilliant fire in Elias Montgomery's eyes finally extinguished. 3 days later, the skies over Atlanta opened up, unleashing a torrential downpour that matched the profound heaviness in my chest. The funeral was a private, highly secured affair held at the historic Montgomery family estate. I stood perfectly still beneath a large black umbrella, staring straight ahead at the twin mahogany caskets. A slow tracking shot of the scene would have captured the stark reality of my new existence. I wore a tailored black morning suit, my posture rigid, my expression carved from stone. Standing directly beside me was Jaden, now 10 years old. He wore a miniature black suit, his small hand gripping mine with a maturity that broke my heart. He did not fidget. He stood tall, mirroring my exact posture, a young prince standing beside the new queen. The loss was a physical ache, a gaping void in my chest, but I refused to let the gathered circle of executive board members and legal advisors see me shatter. I was a Montgomery now, and Montgomerys do not break in public. The following morning, I sat at the head of the massive obsidian conference table in the highest tower of Montgomery Holdings. The room was silent except for the rustling of thick parchment paper. Arthur Vance, the lead attorney for the Montgomery estate, sat across from me, sliding a towering stack of leather-bound binders across the polished glass. Arthur adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and formally read the final declarations of the trust. The numbers were staggering. Elias and Josephine had left me absolute, unmitigated control of the entire conglomerate. I was now the sole owner of commercial real estate portfolios across 3 continents, a fleet of private logistics firms, and a dozen highly lucrative shadow subsidiaries, including Apex Vanguard Capital. The total valuation of the assets transferred directly into my name exceeded $400 million. Arthur closed the final binder and folded his hands. He looked at me with deep, professional respect. He asked how I wanted to handle the public transition. He suggested drafting a press release for the Wall Street Journal and the local financial networks officially announcing Serena Montgomery as the new chief executive officer of the empire. He noted that the markets would want reassurance that the company was in stable, capable hands. I looked down at the gold signet ring Elias had given me, resting heavy on my right index finger. I thought about Preston and Nia laughing in their stolen mansion. I thought about my mother demanding I clear their dirty plates for $200. I thought about the toxic high-yield loan Preston had signed, giving Apex Vanguard Capital the right to seize his entire life the moment he defaulted. Absolute power is a dangerous weapon, but it is infinitely more lethal when it is completely invisible. I looked up at Arthur, my eyes cold and entirely devoid of hesitation. I told him there would be no press release. I ordered him to invoke every non-disclosure agreement and corporate privacy shield at our disposal. I instructed the legal team to bury the adoption records in sealed trusts and route my executive authority through 3 layers of anonymous shell companies. Arthur looked confused. He warned me that keeping my identity hidden would require massive legal maneuvering and asked why I would want to hide my rightful ascension to the throne. I leaned back in the high-backed leather executive chair, the entire weight of the $400 million empire resting comfortably on my shoulders. I told him that my biological family still firmly believed I was a struggling, desperate single mother scraping by on minimum wage. I said they were currently standing on a very high, very fragile pedestal, looking down at me with absolute contempt. I instructed Arthur to let them keep looking down. I told him to let them enjoy their false sense of superiority for exactly 25 more days, because when the first of the month arrived and Preston missed his loan payment, the collection agents from Apex Vanguard would come knocking on his door, and I wanted to be the one standing on his porch to collect the debt. The struggling single mom facade would remain perfectly intact until the exact second I pulled the entire world out from under them. The heavy brass knocker on my apartment door rattled so violently it shook the cheap wooden frame. I had kept this cramped two-bedroom unit in the working-class district of Atlanta precisely for moments like this. It was my stage, my camouflage, and my absolute defense against a family obsessed with appearances. I unlocked the deadbolt, and the door was forcefully shoved open before I could even turn the knob. My mother Vivian marched into my narrow hallway, followed closely by my father Arthur and my sister Nia. They brought the suffocating scent of expensive floral perfume and aggressive entitlement into my modest living space, looking around at my faded furniture with undisguised revulsion. Vivian did not offer a greeting. She did not ask about her grandson Jaden. She simply strode over to my scratched formica dining table and slapped a manila folder down with a sharp, resounding crack. She slid a sleek silver pen right next to it. She demanded that I sign the papers immediately. I stood near the kitchen counter, crossing my arms over my simple cotton sweater. I asked what exactly she was ordering me to sign. Arthur stepped forward, his face pinched in a mask of severe judgment. He coldly informed me that Great Uncle Henry had passed away unexpectedly 2 days ago in his sleep. I felt a sudden, genuine pang of grief strike my chest. Uncle Henry had been the only member of our extended family who did not treat me like a contagious disease after I had Jaden. He had quietly sent me $50 bills inside handmade birthday cards when things were desperately tight. I asked when the funeral was. Vivian waved her hand dismissively, stating that the funeral was a minor detail they would handle later. The pressing issue, she insisted, was the will. Nia stepped up beside our mother wearing a pristine white designer trench coat and a look of deep, agitated impatience. She crossed her arms, matching my posture but exuding a toxic, condescending pity. Nia explained that Uncle Henry had left behind a dusty, undeveloped plot of land in the rural outskirts of the city. According to his deeply misguided will, the acreage was split equally between Nia and me. But Nia quickly added that keeping the land was entirely out of the question. She announced with a smug, arrogant tilt of her chin that Preston was on the absolute verge of closing a massive commercial development project. She claimed it was the biggest deal of his career, an expansion that would cement his firm as a titan in the real estate market. However, he needed immediate liquid capital to secure the final zoning permits and push the construction forward. Vivian tapped the manila folder with a manicured fingernail. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my plain clothes. She stated that I had no college degree, no financial literacy, and absolutely no concept of how to manage a real estate asset. She said that giving me property was a complete waste of resources. She told me that I would likely just squander the land or sell it for pennies to pay my rent. Nia, she claimed, was building a legacy. Nia needed the equity to support Preston's brilliant vision. Vivian ordered me to sign the quitclaim deed, transferring my entire 50% stake directly over to my sister. I walked slowly toward the table. The sheer audacity of their intrusion, the casual way they dismissed Uncle Henry's death to pillage his final gift, was nauseating. But the cold, highly trained executive mind that Elias Montgomery had built inside me instantly recognized a massive, glaring anomaly. Preston was a hedge fund manager who supposedly moved millions of dollars a week. Why would a man with that kind of capital send his wife and in-laws to aggressively bully a single mother out of half a rural dirt lot? It reeked of absolute desperate panic. I picked up the manila folder and opened it, pulling out the legal deed. I ignored my mother's impatient sighs and read the document line by line. My eyes scanned past the dense legal jargon and locked onto the exact property address printed at the bottom of the second page. The air in my lungs turned to ice. A thrilling, dangerous surge of adrenaline spiked through my veins. I knew that address. I knew it intimately. It was not just a random plot of rural dirt. It was a highly contested parcel of land sitting directly adjacent to the exact commercial development project Preston had leveraged his entire life to acquire. The project funded by the toxic 22% interest loan from Apex Vanguard Capital. My company. The trap suddenly illuminated itself in brilliant, blinding clarity in my mind. Preston did not need my half of the land for liquid capital. He needed the physical land itself. The zoning boards in that specific district required developers to own contiguous acreage to secure commercial building permits. Uncle Henry's land was the missing puzzle piece, right in the middle of Preston's development map. Without my signature transferring that land to Nia, Preston could not get the permits. Without the permits, he could not break ground. And if he could not break ground, he would immediately default on the $40 million loan he owed to my shadow subsidiary. Preston was not building a legacy. He was drowning, and my signature was the only life raft he had left. I set the document back down on the Formica table. I looked up at my family. They were staring at me with expectant, arrogant expressions, completely convinced that I was too stupid to understand the gold mine sitting in front of me. Nia let out an exasperated breath, uncrossing her arms. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a crisp stack of $100 bills, dropping them onto the table next to the deed. She said she knew things were always hard for me. She offered the cash, stating it was $1,000. She told me to take the money, buy Jaden some new clothes, and sign the paper. She framed it as a charitable favor, a generous sister rescuing her pathetic sibling from the burden of property taxes. She smiled a sharp, venomous smile and told me it was the best deal I was ever going to get in my life. $1,000 for a property that held the key to a $40 million corporate acquisition. I looked at the cash, then up at my sister. The urge to laugh was almost suffocating, but I kept my face entirely blank. I picked up the silver pen. Vivian and Arthur both leaned forward slightly, their eyes tracking my hand. A hungry, desperate relief flashing across their faces. I hovered the pen over the signature line, letting them taste the victory. Then I set the pen down gently and pushed the manila folder back across the table. I told them I was not signing it. The silence that hit the apartment was deafening. Vivian's mouth actually dropped open. Arthur's face flushed a deep mottled red. Nia stared at the folder as if it had just caught fire. Arthur slammed his fist onto the table, making the cheap wood shudder. He demanded to know what was wrong with me. He shouted that I was being completely irrational and selfish. He reminded me that I had embarrassed this family 10 years ago by dropping out and getting pregnant, and that I owed them this compliance to make up for my failures. He said I was standing in the way of real progress, of true success. Vivian stepped right up to me, her voice dropping into a vicious, threatening hiss. She told me that if I did not pick up that pen, she would personally ensure I was cut off from every single connection in the city. She threatened to call every catering company and temp agency to ruin my reputation so thoroughly I would not be able to find work scrubbing toilets. She pointed a trembling finger at my face and told me I was a foolish, ungrateful child who had no idea how the real world worked. I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who had drained my college fund to cover Nia's gambling debts, who had cast me out into the cold, and who was now threatening to starve my son just to protect her wealthy son-in-law. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. The calm radiating from my core was absolute and terrifying. I told Vivian that her threats were meaningless. I told Arthur that my debt to this family had been paid in full the night they threw me out of their house. And I turned to Nia, looking at the stark panic beginning to crack her perfect porcelain mask. I told my sister to tell Preston that if he wanted my land, he could come and negotiate with me himself like a real businessman. Nia let out a shrill, furious scream. She snatched the cash off the table and shoved the folder into her bag, her hands shaking with uncontrolled rage. She spat that I was going to regret this, that Preston was going to crush me, and that I would end up begging them for forgiveness. I stood completely still as they stormed out of my apartment, slamming the heavy door so hard the hinges groaned. I waited, listening to their hurried, angry footsteps echo down the hallway and fade into the stairwell. When the building was finally silent, I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up my secure, encrypted Montgomery Holdings phone. I dialed the direct line to Arthur Vance, my lead corporate attorney. He answered on the first ring. I ordered Mr. Vance to immediately contact the county zoning commission. I instructed him to place an aggressive corporate hold on every single permit related to Preston's commercial development project, citing a pending territorial dispute regarding the contiguous boundaries. Then I gave him my final command. I told him to draft the default and foreclosure notices for Apex Vanguard Capital. I hung up the phone and looked out my small apartment window, watching my family's luxury SUV speed away down the street. Elias was right. The view from the bottom was the most dangerous place in the world because no one ever sees you coming until the entire sky falls on their head. I barely had time to slide the encrypted Montgomery Holdings phone back into my pocket when the heavy wooden door of my apartment flew open once again. It slammed violently against the drywall, leaving a dent in the cheap plaster. I had underestimated the sheer depth of their desperation. Vivian marched back into my living room, her face completely stripped of its previous affluent composure. She was no longer a wealthy suburban socialite trying to manage an embarrassing relative. She was a cornered predator. Arthur and Nia trailed behind her, looking equally frantic. They had reached the bottom of the stairwell and realized they could not go back to Preston's failing hedge fund empty-handed. The commercial development project was their only lifeline, and my signature was the only way to secure it. My mother closed the distance between us in 3 rapid strides, invading my personal space. The oppressive scent of her perfume mixed with the sour smell of her nervous sweat. She did not bother with the manila folder this time. She grabbed it from Nia's trembling hands and shoved the deed directly against my chest, forcing me to take it. She dropped her voice into a vicious, guttural whisper that chilled the air in the room. She stated that I was going to sign the paper right now, or she was going to make a phone call that would end my life as a mother. I kept my hands at my sides, letting the document fall to the floor between us. I asked her what she was talking about. Vivian leaned in so close I could see the makeup settling into the fine lines around her mouth. She told me she had high-ranking connections at the Department of Child and Family Services. She said she would call them the second she stepped out of this building and report me as an unfit, unstable mother. She detailed the exact narrative she would feed them. She would tell the state investigators that I lived in a dangerous, low-income neighborhood, that I worked erratic hours, leaving my 10-year-old son neglected and completely unsupervised. She would claim I suffered from severe, untreated mental illness and that Jaden was in imminent physical danger. Arthur stepped up beside her, nodding in solemn agreement. He added that with their wealth and community standing, the courts would absolutely believe them. They would testify against me under oath. They would paint me as a reckless college dropout who could not provide a stable environment. They would have Jaden removed from my custody, placed into the foster care system, and eventually legally adopted by a family of their choosing. The absolute depravity of the threat hung heavily in the cramped apartment. They were weaponizing the foster care system, a system known for destroying vulnerable families, to blackmail me out of a piece of real estate. My own parents were threatening to rip my child from my arms and hand him over to the state just to protect their son-in-law's fragile ego and bank account. 10 years ago, this threat would have destroyed me. 10 years ago, I would have collapsed onto the floor, hyperventilating, begging for mercy, because I had zero resources and no legal protection. But today, I was the acting CEO of a $400 million empire. I had a team of 50 elite corporate litigators on retainer who could obliterate any false CPS claim Vivian dared to file before she even hung up the phone. I could bury my parents in so much legal red tape they would never see the light of day. But Elias Montgomery had trained me to play the long game. If I refused to sign the deed, they would walk away. If they walked away, Preston would not be able to secure the contiguous land required for his commercial zoning permits. He would simply fail the project and default on the loan. That was too easy. That was too clean. I did not just want Preston to fail. I wanted Nia and my parents chained directly to the sinking ship when it went down. I needed them to take ownership of Uncle Henry's land. I needed them to swallow the poison pill. To make them take the bait, I had to give them exactly what they expected to see. I had to give them the broken, terrified girl they loved to torture. I let my breath hitch audibly. I widened my eyes, forcing a frantic, desperate panic to flood my expression. I brought my hands up to my face, letting my shoulders tremble as if the weight of her threat had physically crushed me. I pushed moisture into my eyes, allowing real tears to spill over my lashes. I begged my mother not to do this. I let my voice crack, feigning absolute hysterical terror. I told her that Jaden was my entire world and that she could not take him from me. I pleaded with Arthur, looking at him with wide, frightened eyes, promising that I would do whatever they wanted if they just left my son alone. The transformation in their demeanor was instantaneous and sickening. The frantic desperation melted off Vivian's face, replaced by a deep, intoxicating surge of power. She thrived on my submission. She reveled in seeing me reduced to a crying, pleading mess. Arthur stood taller, his chest puffed out with arrogant authority. Nia let out a sharp, cruel laugh, stepping over the fallen document to retrieve the silver pen from the table. Nia picked up the quitclaim deed from the floor and slapped it back onto the Formica counter. She shoved the pen into my trembling hand. She sneered, looking at my tears with undisguised revulsion, telling me that I should have just known my place from the start. She said this was what happened when people like me tried to play games with people like them. I kept my hand shaking deliberately as I pressed the pen to the paper. I let out a soft, pathetic sob, signing my name on the dotted line, transferring my entire 50% legal stake of Uncle Henry's property directly into Nia's name. Nia snatched the paper before the ink was even dry. She inspected the signature, her eyes gleaming with greedy triumph. She folded the document carefully and slipped it into her designer handbag, securing the gold clasp. She turned to our mother, announcing that they finally had everything Preston needed to close the massive deal. Vivian looked down at me with cold, clinical disgust. She told me I was lucky they were even leaving the $1,000 on the table. She advised me to use the cash to pay my rent and to never attempt to contact them again. She stated that as far as their high society circle was concerned, I did not exist. They turned in unison and walked out of the apartment, the victorious click of their expensive shoes echoing in the hallway. The door shut firmly behind them, leaving the $1,000 sitting on my scratched dining table. I stood in the center of the living room listening until the sound of their footsteps faded completely. The second the building was silent, my tears vanished instantly. My shaking hands steadied and my posture straightened. The terrified pleading victim evaporated, replaced by the cold, calculating architect of their impending ruin. I picked up the stack of $100 bills from the table, thumbing through the crisp currency with a dark, terrifying smile. They were utterly blinded by their own arrogance. They thought they had just bullied a helpless woman out of a valuable asset. They had no idea. They had just voluntarily, legally shackled themselves to a financial landmine. Uncle Henry was a good man, but he was not a wealthy one. He had kept that specific parcel of land a secret from the family for decades because it was not an asset. It was a massive toxic liability. The property was a designated federal wetland protection zone that had been illegally filled and dumped on by a previous commercial tenant. The Environmental Protection Agency had cited the land 5 years ago, attaching a staggering federal ecological tax lien to the property. The unpaid fines, the mandated cleanup costs, and the accumulated back taxes amounted to over $8 million. As long as the land was split between heirs, the liability was tied up in probate court. But by bullying me into signing the quitclaim deed, Nia had aggressively and legally assumed 100% sole ownership of the property. She had just eagerly accepted an $8 million federal tax debt that she and her husband were now entirely personally responsible for. The EPA did not negotiate with wealthy suburbanites, and they certainly did not care about hedge fund managers. They would freeze Preston's personal accounts the moment the deed was filed with the county clerk. But that was only the first layer of the trap. Nia believed Preston needed this land to secure the zoning permits for his massive career-defining commercial development project. She thought this deal would elevate them to the highest echelon of the city's elite. What neither Nia Preston nor my parents knew was that the glorious commercial project Preston was trying to buy into did not actually exist. It was a phantom development. It was a highly sophisticated, incredibly lucrative bait project manufactured entirely by Montgomery Holdings. Months ago, Elias had instructed our shell companies to purchase a massive block of worthless industrial zoning near the wetlands. We drafted fake architectural renderings, generated artificial municipal buzz, and planted the bait specifically where Preston's eager, over-leveraged hedge fund would find it. Preston had just borrowed $40 million from my shadow lending firm at 22% interest to invest in a fake Montgomery Holdings project that required him to secure land carrying an $8 million federal tax lien. I walked over to the kitchen counter, picked up my encrypted phone, and sent a single text message to Arthur Vance. The message instructed him to alert the Environmental Protection Agency that the deed for the wetland property had officially been transferred to a new sole owner. I tossed the $1,000 into the kitchen trash can. My family had wanted to play a game of power and leverage. I was about to show them exactly how the game was played at the very top. The camera glides smoothly across the polished surface of a massive mahogany dining table, tracking the precise, deliberate movements of my hands. I slide heavy gold-foiled cardstock into thick, cream-colored envelopes, pressing the edges down with a satisfying crispness. I am 35 years old now, sitting in the sun-drenched living room of a private penthouse that overlooks the sprawling financial district. The city below is a grid of concrete and glass that I systematically control, but inside this sanctuary, everything is quiet and meticulously ordered. I pick up a custom brass stamp, press it onto a pool of hot crimson wax, and seal the envelope. A pair of strong, warm hands wrap gently around my shoulders, pulling me back against a solid chest. I do not flinch. I lean into the embrace, letting the scent of sterile hospital soap and expensive cedarwood wash over me. Isaiah rests his chin on the top of my head, his thumbs tracing the line of my collarbone. He is fresh off a grueling 12-hour shift in the neurological ward, but his eyes when I tilt my head back to look at him are bright and entirely focused on me. Isaiah is not a corporate shark. He does not care about leverage acquisitions or hostile takeovers. He is a brilliant neurosurgeon, a man who spends his days holding human lives in his hands with terrifying precision. He knows exactly who I am. He knows about the Montgomery Empire, the billions of dollars resting in offshore accounts, and the ruthless, unyielding woman I have to be in the boardroom. More importantly, he knows the broken girl I used to be, and he has spent the last 6 years loving both versions of me, without condition and without hesitation. He loves Jaden as his own son, stepping into the role of a father with a quiet, steadfast strength that healed the deepest wounds in our lives. He looks down at the stack of sealed envelopes and lets out a soft, knowing sigh. He asks if I am absolutely certain I want to do this. He reminds me that our wedding day is supposed to be about us, about our future, and the life we have built together. He gently points out that inviting the people who tried to destroy me might bring a darkness into the light we have fought so hard to create. I turn in his arms, resting my hands flat against his chest. I look up into his dark, steady eyes and tell him that a ghost cannot truly rest until it haunts the people who buried it. I explain that my biological family has spent the last few weeks choking on the invisible toxic fumes of the environmental tax lien they so eagerly stole from me. They are suffocating under the weight of Preston's failing hedge fund and the impending collapse of their social standing. But they are still clinging to their delusions. They still believe they are kings and queens ruling over a peasant. I tell Isaiah that the trap is already sprung, but the execution requires a public stage. I need them to walk into the very heart of my empire entirely of their own free will. I need them to dress in their finest clothes, puff out their chests, and march directly into the absolute center of my world. Isaiah studies my face for a long moment. He sees the cold, unyielding determination in my eyes, and a slow, proud smile spreads across his face. He kisses my forehead, telling me to send the invitations. He says he cannot wait to stand beside me and watch their house of cards finally burn to ash. Just as he steps away to check on Jaden, my personal cell phone begins to vibrate violently against the mahogany table. The screen lights up, flashing a name I have not seen illuminate my device in months. Nia. I pick up the phone, my thumb hovering over the green accept button. I take a slow, measured breath, centering myself, shifting instantly from the loving partner into the architect of their destruction. I press the phone to my ear and offer a polite, neutral greeting. Nia does not say hello. She lets out a sharp, piercing laugh that grates against the quiet elegance of my penthouse. The sound is high and thin, laced with a frantic, manic energy. She announces that she honestly could not believe her eyes when the mail arrived this morning. She tells me our mother almost threw the cheap little envelope straight into the shredder, thinking it was a solicitation for a charity. She asks with dripping, venomous sarcasm if I am actually getting married. She wants to know who exactly was desperate enough to take on a charity case like me. She asks if it is some plumber who came to fix my leaky sink, or a delivery driver who felt sorry for the pathetic woman living in a rundown apartment. I do not interrupt her. I stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the skyscrapers, I own letting her dig her grave deeper with every word. Nia continues, her voice rising in volume, determined to make me feel as small as possible. She demands to know where this tragic little ceremony is taking place. She mocks the address printed on the card, noting that it does not sound like a country club or a luxury hotel. She asks if I rented out a dilapidated community center, or if we are just going to stand in a public park and exchange plastic rings. She brags loudly, making sure I can hear the desperate pride in her voice. She says her own wedding cost $500,000, that they served imported caviar and flew in a string quartet from Vienna. She reminds me that she is the wife of a visionary hedge fund manager, and that she is accustomed to a certain caliber of living. She does not mention the fact that Preston's firm is currently facing aggressive federal audits. She does not mention the $8 million environmental tax lien attached to the land she bullied me into signing over. She is projecting a desperate, flawless illusion clinging to the edge of a cliff, while pretending she is learning how to fly. She tells me that Vivian and Arthur thought it would be completely humiliating to attend such a low-class event. They were fully prepared to ignore the invitation and pretend I did not exist. But Nia claims she convinced them otherwise. She says she told our parents that it is their Christian duty to show pity to the less fortunate. Nia tells me that she and Preston will be attending my little wedding. She says they are coming to bestow their blessing upon my tragic life. She promises to wear something understated so she does not completely overshadow me on my big day, though she notes that will be incredibly difficult. Her tone turns sharp and predatory as she brings up my son. She says it will be a good opportunity for Jaden to see them. She wants to show my boy what real luxury, actual wealth, and true success look like, so he knows exactly what he is missing out on by being stuck with a mother like me. She finishes her long, vicious monologue, panting slightly, her chest heaving with the effort of projecting her false superiority. She waits for my reaction. She expects me to cry to defend my fiancé, to beg her not to cause a scene, or to angrily uninvite her. She wants to feed on my insecurity. I look down at the heavy gold ring on my finger, the crest of the Montgomery Empire catching the afternoon light. I do not raise my voice. I do not offer a single word of defense or explanation. My voice is incredibly calm, crisp, and utterly devoid of emotion. I tell her that is absolutely wonderful news. I tell her I am thrilled they have decided to grace us with their presence. I instruct her to gather our parents to dress in their absolute finest clothes and to bring Preston along to see the spectacle. I look out over the city, my reflection superimposing over the glass. I tell her to just go to the exact address printed on the heavy cardstock. And I tell her whatever she does, she absolutely must not be late. Across the city, the illusion of perfect aristocratic wealth that my family had so violently protected was actively tearing at the seams. Inside the cold, sterile walls of his multi-million-dollar suburban mansion, Preston Vance was suffocating. He sat alone in his expansive mahogany-paneled home office, the heavy double doors firmly locked against his wife and her parents. His tailored Italian suit jacket was thrown carelessly across a leather armchair, and his silk tie hung loosely around his neck. He was a man whose entire existence was predicated on the projection of absolute control, but the mountain of paperwork scattered across his desk told the undeniable truth of a man who was about to lose everything. The trap I had laid for him had snapped shut with bone-crushing precision. The official notices from the Environmental Protection Agency had arrived by certified federal mail that very morning. They were printed on stark white paper with bold red lettering, demanding the immediate payment of $8 million in ecological back taxes, fines, and hazard cleanup fees. Because Nia had so aggressively bullied me into signing the quitclaim deed, she had legally assumed 100% sole ownership of Uncle Henry's wetland property. By extension, as her legal spouse, Preston, was now personally liable for the massive federal debt attached to that toxic land. The consequences had been instantaneous and catastrophic. The federal government did not negotiate with arrogant hedge fund managers, and they did not care about his country club memberships. They had immediately initiated a hard freeze on his personal checking accounts, his investment portfolios, and his corporate operating funds. He was entirely locked out of his own money. But the tax lien was only the first fatal blow. Preston frantically shuffled through the documents, pulling up the final default notice from Apex Vanguard Capital. He had borrowed $40 million at a predatory 22% interest rate to buy into what he believed was the most lucrative commercial development project in the state. He had spent the last 48 hours leaving increasingly desperate voicemails for the municipal zoning board, begging them to approve his construction permits, now that his wife owned the contiguous land. The zoning commissioner had finally returned his call an hour ago. The commissioner had sounded genuinely confused, informing Preston that no commercial development project had ever been slated for that district. The entire project was a phantom. It was a brilliantly constructed mirage consisting of fake architectural renderings, artificial municipal buzz, and dummy corporate filings created by Montgomery Holdings specifically to bait him. Preston had borrowed $40 million to invest in empty air. Without a real project to generate revenue, he was in immediate and irreversible default. Preston gripped his hair, pulling hard enough to hurt his breath, coming in shallow, panicked gasps. He had been played. He had been systematically outmaneuvered by a corporate entity so massive and invisible, he could not even begin to fight back. He owed $40 million to a shadow lender and $8 million to the federal government. He was facing total financial ruin, public humiliation, and potential federal prison time for the fraudulent collateral he had used to secure his initial loans. A sharp, aggressive knock on his office door made him jump. The heavy brass handle rattled as someone tried to force it open. Nia's voice pierced through the thick oak, demanding that he unlock the door immediately. She was accompanied by the muffled, impatient voices of Vivian and Arthur. They were completely oblivious to the fact that they were standing inside a burning house. Preston scrambled, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. He frantically swept the EPA tax liens and the foreclosure notices into a desk drawer, slamming it shut and locking it with a key. He took a deep, shaky breath, smoothing down his shirt and forcing his facial muscles into a mask of arrogant, unbothered confidence. He could not let them see his panic. If his in-laws discovered the truth, they would immediately pull their remaining retirement investments from his hedge fund, which would trigger an SEC investigation and guarantee his immediate arrest. He had to keep them pacified. He had to maintain the illusion of success for just a little while longer. He unlocked the door, pulling it open with a practiced hollow smile. Vivian marched into the room first, holding the gold-foiled wedding invitation I had just mailed them. She looked disgusted, waving the heavy cardstock in the air, as if it were contaminated. She complained bitterly about my audacity, claiming that I was trying to humiliate them by inviting them to whatever low-class, pathetic ceremony I had scraped together. Arthur echoed her sentiments, crossing his arms and scoffing at the idea of attending a wedding funded by a bakery worker's salary. Nia stood beside her husband, completely validated by her recent phone call, with me boasting about how she had put me in my place, and reminded me of my utter insignificance. Preston listened to their petty, superficial complaints while his own world was collapsing. The sheer absurdity of their vanity made his stomach churn, but he saw an opportunity to use their arrogance to his advantage. He needed to buy himself time to figure a way out of the Montgomery Holdings trap. Preston poured himself a glass of expensive scotch, his hand trembling only slightly as the amber liquid hit the crystal. He turned to his in-laws and delivered the most spectacular, desperate lie of his entire career. He told them to stop wasting their energy worrying about my pathetic little wedding. He waved his hand dismissively, stating that they were playing a game of pennies while he was operating on a global scale. He puffed out his chest, looking directly at Arthur, and announced that he had just secured the biggest financial partnership in the history of his firm. He claimed that the minor delays with his commercial development project were actually a strategic pause, because he had attracted the attention of the apex predator of the corporate world. Preston lied with the smooth, practiced ease of a career con artist. He told his wife and my parents that he had been personally contacted by the elusive anonymous chairman of Montgomery Holdings. He claimed that the chairman had reviewed his investment portfolio and recognized his unparalleled financial genius. He spun a magnificent delusion, stating that Montgomery Holdings was planning to inject a massive amount of bailout capital into his hedge fund, effectively partnering with him to dominate the real estate market. He promised Vivian and Arthur that this partnership would quadruple their investments and elevate the family to a level of untouchable billionaire status. To solidify the lie, Preston leaned against his desk and announced that he had a private, exclusive face-to-face meeting with the chairman scheduled for this coming weekend. He claimed the summit was taking place at a sprawling private mega mansion on the outskirts of the city, a location reserved only for the absolute elite. The reaction was immediate and nauseating. Vivian gasped, pressing her hands to her chest, her eyes wide with greedy adoration. Arthur clapped Preston heavily on the shoulder, praising his brilliance and calling him the true savior of the family legacy. Nia practically swooned, wrapping her arms around her husband's neck and kissing his cheek. She looked at her parents and smugly declared that this was exactly why she had married a visionary. Nia's vanity instantly took control of the narrative. She clapped her hands together, a malicious gleam appearing in her eyes. She announced that the timing was absolutely perfect. She stated that they would attend Preston's glorious corporate summit at the mega mansion, secure the billions of dollars from Montgomery Holdings, and then drive directly to my tragic little wedding. She wanted to walk into my ceremony dripping in the fresh triumph of their massive financial victory. She wanted to look down at my new husband and show us both what true power looked like. Preston smiled, nodding along with their vicious fantasies, but behind his eyes a dark, suffocating terror was consuming him. He had not been invited to a partnership summit. He had received a cold automated email from the legal department of Apex Vanguard Capital, summoning him to a mandatory financial reckoning. The email had stated in no uncertain terms that he was required to appear at a designated address this weekend to answer for his defaulted $40 million loan. He was walking straight into a corporate slaughterhouse, hoping he could somehow talk his way out of complete destruction. He was bringing his entire family along to maintain his facade, completely unaware of the trap closing around his throat. Sitting in my penthouse miles away, I received a notification on my encrypted phone. It was a message from Arthur Vance, confirming that Preston Vance had officially RSVP'd to his mandatory default hearing. I looked at the digital confirmation and then down at the remaining stack of gold-foiled wedding invitations on my table. Preston was a desperate man fighting for his life, but he had missed the most glaring, catastrophic detail of all. In his blind panic to hide his failure, he had not checked the location of his corporate execution. He had absolutely no idea that the sprawling mega mansion where he was scheduled to face the chairman of Montgomery Holdings was the exact same address printed on the wedding invitation currently sitting on his kitchen counter. In the lavish master bedroom of his sprawling suburban estate, Preston stood before a full-length mirror, struggling to tie his silk cravat. His fingers were slick with cold sweat, slipping against the expensive fabric. He had not slept in 3 days. The dark circles under his eyes were impossible to conceal, and a fine tremor had taken permanent residence in his hands. He was a man marching toward a firing squad, but he was forced to wear a tuxedo and pretend it was a parade. Down the hall, Vivian and Nia were operating in a state of manic euphoric vanity. The air in the guest suite was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive hairspray and imported floral perfumes. They had spent the entire morning treating their preparation like a royal coronation. Vivian stood draped in a silver designer gown, clasping a heavy diamond necklace around her throat. She lectured Arthur, who was admiring his own reflection in a tailored charcoal suit, on how exactly they would handle the billionaire chairman. She rehearsed her polite but deferential laughs, practicing the exact angle of her chin that conveyed old money sophistication. She was completely convinced that by the end of the day, they would be welcomed into the highest echelon of global wealth. Nia emerged from the walk-in closet wearing a pristine pearl-white dress that bordered dangerously on bridal. It was a calculated, malicious choice. She had spent $10,000 on the gown specifically to outshine whatever cheap polyester dress she assumed I would be wearing. She preened in front of the mirror, tilting her head and imagining the look of absolute, crushing defeat on my face when she walked into my tragic little ceremony dripping in diamonds and fresh corporate billions. Preston entered the kitchen a few minutes later, gripping his leather briefcase like a life preserver. Inside that briefcase was the stark, terrifying legal summons from Apex Vanguard Capital, the document demanding his presence at a mandatory default hearing for his $40 million debt. He poured himself a generous glass of scotch, abandoning all pretense of morning propriety, and downed it in a single desperate swallow. He needed the burn in his chest to ground him to stop his heart from hammering against his ribs. Nia walked into the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply against the imported marble floors. She carried her glittering clutch in one hand and the heavy gold-foiled wedding invitation I had sent her in the other. She tossed the invitation onto the quartz island, letting out a sharp, disdainful laugh. She told Preston they needed to coordinate the logistics of the afternoon. She wanted to know exactly how long his summit with the Montgomery Holdings chairman would take, because she did not want to miss the opportunity to ruin my processional. Preston set his empty glass down, his hand shaking. He pulled the crisp white legal summons from his briefcase to check the address. He told Nia the meeting was at a private estate in the exclusive Northern Hills. He read the street name aloud, his voice tight and breathless. Nia stopped rummaging through her clutch. She frowned, picking up the gold-foiled wedding invitation from the island. She stared at the elegant calligraphy stamped into the thick paper. She slowly read the address printed on my invitation. Then she looked up at Preston, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. She asked him to repeat the address of the corporate summit. Preston read the address again, his eyes scanning the stark black text of the legal summons. The silence that fell over the kitchen was absolute and deafening. Nia placed the gold invitation directly next to the federal default notice. The two pieces of paper sat side by side on the cold marble. The address was exactly the same, down to the street number, the zip code, and the private access road. The sprawling mega mansion where Preston was scheduled to meet the anonymous billionaire chairman was the exact same location where I was holding my wedding. Preston stared at the two pieces of paper. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of ash gray. The invisible walls of the trap I had built suddenly materialized around him, closing in with terrifying speed. He could not breathe. His mind frantically tried to process the mathematical impossibility of the situation. Why would the most ruthless corporate entity in the country operate out of the same location as his worthless sister-in-law's wedding? The sheer terror of the unknown gripped his throat. Nia, however, lacked the survival instinct that comes with genuine business acumen. Her supreme, staggering arrogance immediately erected a wall of delusion to protect her fragile worldview. She let out a loud, mocking laugh, waving her manicured hand dismissively over the documents. She told Preston to calm down and stop looking so panicked. She confidently deduced that the estate must be a massive historic property with public grounds attached to the back. Vivian and Arthur swept into the kitchen just in time to hear the revelation. Vivian adjusted her diamond earrings and immediately agreed with Nia's assessment. She scoffed, stating that I had likely rented a cheap, dilapidated gazebo near the service entrance of the estate. Arthur chuckled, crossing his arms, and adding that I was probably working as a caterer for the Montgomery family and had begged the property manager to let me use a patch of grass by the dumpsters for a 10-minute ceremony. They convinced themselves within seconds. Their deep-seated prejudice against me was so profound, so thoroughly ingrained in their psychology, that they literally could not comprehend any other reality. The idea that I could be associated with the wealth of that estate in any meaningful way was a mathematical impossibility in their minds. They laughed it off, completely reinvigorated by the thought of arriving at the billionaire's mansion to secure their financial empire and then simply walking around to the servants' quarters to humiliate me. Preston wanted to believe them. He desperately needed to believe them. He shoved the legal summons back into his briefcase, snapping the locks shut. He forced a rigid, strained smile onto his face and ushered his family toward the waiting luxury SUV. He told himself it was just a bizarre coincidence. He told himself he could still salvage the $40 million debt. He climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The drive to the northern hills was filled with the toxic, joyful chatter of a family marching blindly toward a slaughterhouse. Vivian and Nia spent the entire hour gossiping about my failures, picking apart my life choices, and planning exactly what they would say to completely destroy my confidence. Arthur sat in the passenger seat lecturing Preston on how to properly shake hands with a billionaire, demanding that Preston secure a board seat for him once the bailout funds were transferred. Preston stared blankly at the road ahead, entirely consumed by a cold, creeping dread. They turned off the main highway and onto the private access road, winding their way through dense, ancient forests until they reached the perimeter of the Montgomery estate. The sheer scale of the property immediately silenced the arrogant chatter in the car. Massive wrought iron gates towered above them, flanked by heavily armed private security personnel. Beyond the gates, a pristine manicured driveway stretched for a mile, leading up to a breathtaking modern palace of glass steel and black marble. Vivian pressed her hands to the glass, her mouth dropping open in raw, naked greed. Nia sat up straight, her eyes wide, practically salivating at the display of absolute, untouchable power. This was not just wealth. This was an empire. This was the kind of money that bought governments and reshaped skylines. Preston pulled up to the security checkpoint, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. A guard in a sharp black suit approached the window holding a digital tablet. Preston rolled down the window, clearing his throat and attempting to project an air of executive authority. He stated his name and announced that he was there for his scheduled appointment with the chairman of Montgomery Holdings. He added, pointing to the women in the back seat, that his family was also there to attend a wedding on the grounds. The security guard did not blink. He did not ask for clarification or express any confusion. He simply tapped the screen of his tablet, verifying the information. He looked down at Preston with cold, dead eyes. He stated in a flat, mechanical voice that Mr. Vance and his party were expected. The heavy iron gates swung open with a deep, mechanical groan. Preston drove the SUV slowly up the sweeping driveway, the tires crunching softly against the crushed white gravel. Nia and Vivian were practically vibrating in their seats, completely intoxicated by the proximity to such unimaginable wealth. They were entirely convinced that this was their coronation, their formal induction into elite society. They stepped out of the vehicle and handed the keys to a waiting valet, smoothing their designer clothes and lifting their chins with arrogant pride. They walked up the wide marble steps toward the massive double doors of the estate, completely entirely unaware that the ruthless anonymous chairman they were coming to beg for their financial lives, and the pathetic sister they were planning to mock, were the exact same woman waiting quietly inside. The heavy mahogany double doors swung open seamlessly, pulled back by two impeccably dressed ushers wearing crisp white gloves. Stepping over the threshold, Vivian, Arthur, Nia, and Preston were instantly swallowed by an atmosphere of staggering, unapologetic wealth. They had smugly prepared themselves to walk into a sterile corporate lobby or perhaps a dusty, dilapidated community hall tucked somewhere behind the main property. Instead, they found themselves standing at the apex of a sweeping grand terrace that overlooked the estate's immaculate, sprawling rear gardens. The sheer scale of the event was paralyzing. The valet driveway they had just left was currently organizing a masterclass in automotive excellence. Sleek black Maybachs, custom Rolls-Royces, and limited edition Aston Martins purred quietly as they were meticulously parked in precise geometric lines by a small army of attendants. The air was thick with the scent of thousands of rare white orchids cascading down the marble columns and weaving through the ornate crystal chandeliers suspended above the outdoor pavilion. The attendees flowing gracefully through the estate were not ordinary citizens. They were the undisputed titans of the city. Nia's jaw physically dropped as she recognized the mayor engaged in a warm, animated conversation with the state's most prominent appellate judge. Vivian's eyes darted frantically, taking in the sight of elite venture capitalists, media moguls, and real estate tycoons, all dressed in breathtaking high-fashion couture. This was the absolute apex of the black elite, a concentrated sphere of power and influence that Preston had spent his entire pathetic career desperately trying to claw his way into. Vivian grabbed Arthur's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging fiercely into his expensive suit jacket. She whispered frantically, demanding to know what was happening. She asked how on earth Serena could possibly be getting married at the exact same time and place as the Montgomery Holdings corporate summit. Nia's porcelain mask of superiority was violently cracking, but her supreme arrogance refused to surrender. She clutched her glittering designer bag, her knuckles turning stark white. She stubbornly declared that there was an obvious logical explanation. She insisted in a sharp, breathless whisper that Serena must have begged her blue-collar fiancé to blow his entire life savings just to rent a tiny corner of the garden for 10 minutes. She claimed that the billionaire chairman of Montgomery Holdings was obviously hosting an elite private gala today and was taking pity on the poor, allowing a charity case wedding to happen on the service lawns near the dumpsters. She sneered, convincing herself that my new husband was probably one of the caterers. Preston did not share their arrogant delusions. The cold sweat on the back of his neck had turned into rivers of ice. He recognized the faces in the crowd. These were men who moved billions of dollars before breakfast. These were not people who attended backyard charity weddings or local community center gatherings. They were here for something monumental. His eyes frantically scanned the perimeter, searching for a corporate banner, a boardroom sign, or any indication of the mandatory financial hearing he had been summoned to attend. An usher approached them carrying a gleaming silver tray, adorned with flutes of vintage champagne. Vivian snatched a glass immediately, trying desperately to blend in with the surrounding aristocracy. She lifted her chin, putting on her most practiced socialite smile, and ordered the usher to direct them to the Montgomery Holdings executive meeting room. She haughtily cited Preston's extremely important summit with the chairman, as if the name drop would part the crowd like the Red Sea. The usher offered a polite, perfectly practiced smile, but did not move. He informed them in a smooth, even tone that there were no corporate meetings scheduled for today. He stated with absolute clarity that the entire estate, all 50 acres of it, had been completely locked down for a single exclusive private event. He bowed his head slightly, gesturing toward the grand pavilion, and welcomed them to the Montgomery wedding. The vintage champagne flute slipped from Vivian's trembling hand, shattering violently against the imported Italian marble floor. The sharp crack echoed through the immediate vicinity, drawing brief, irritated glances from the surrounding billionaires. Arthur's face drained of all color, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. Nia let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her eyes darting wildly around the terrace as the mathematical impossibility of the situation began to crush her carefully constructed reality. The Montgomery wedding. It was not a community center. It was not a service lawn. It was a wedding hosted by the very empire Preston was utterly indebted to. The name echoed in Preston's mind, ringing like a death knell. Montgomery. The Phantom Development Project was owned by Montgomery Holdings. The predatory loan threatening to bankrupt him was issued by a Montgomery subsidiary. The mega mansion they were standing in was the Montgomery estate. And the sister they had spent a decade abusing, neglecting, and trying to destroy was standing somewhere inside, preparing to walk down the aisle. Preston felt his knees go weak. The $40 million default, the $8 million federal tax lien, the fake commercial zoning project, and the wedding invitation all slammed together in his mind, forming a perfectly engineered, inescapable cage. He looked at his wife, who was still staring at the shattered glass on the floor, her chest heaving with panicked, shallow breaths. He looked at his mother-in-law, who was clutching her diamond necklace as if it might strangle her. They had walked right through the front door, willingly, enthusiastically bringing their own executioner the rope. Before any of them could speak, before Preston could even suggest turning around and sprinting back to their car, the grand orchestral music playing softly in the background suddenly shifted. The low, steady hum of elite conversation faded into a respectful, expectant silence. The massive cascading doors at the top of the grand sweeping staircase began to slowly pull apart. The entire crowd turned their attention upward, and the reality my family had aggressively denied for over a decade prepared to step directly into the blinding light. The massive doors parted with a heavy metallic glide, revealing the grand foyer of the estate. The sunlight streaming through the towering skylights caught the dust motes in the air, creating a cinematic golden haze. The low hum of the gathered elite died instantly as the crowd parted, forming a wide, immaculate aisle. From the top of the grand marble staircase I emerged. The camera of reality seemed to slow down, capturing every precise movement of my descent. I was not wearing a cheap polyester gown. I was draped in a custom haute couture Oscar de la Renta masterpiece. The silk and hand-stitched lace clung to my frame like liquid armor cascading down the steps in a breathtaking train that whispered against the polished stone. It was a dress that did not just cost money, it cost influence. It demanded absolute total submission from everyone in the room. Walking beside me, his hand lightly supporting my arm, was Jaden. He was no longer the frightened little boy they had mocked and dismissed. At 15 years old, he had grown tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit. His jaw was set in a hard, unforgiving line, and his dark eyes swept over the crowd with a chilling, aristocratic calm. He carried himself with the exact same predatory grace that I had cultivated over the last decade. He was the heir to an empire, and he knew it. At the bottom of the staircase, standing frozen near the entrance, Vivian and Arthur looked as though they had been physically struck by lightning. Vivian's jaw went slack, her eyes bulging out of her skull as she stared at the diamonds glittering at my throat. The heavy heirloom necklace she was so proud of suddenly looked like cheap costume jewelry next to the flawless stones resting against my collarbone. Arthur took a stumbling step backward, his hand gripping his chest. His brain could simply not process the visual data. The disgraced daughter he had erased from his life was descending the staircase of a billionaire's fortress looking like a reigning monarch. Preston stood paralyzed beside them. He felt the air completely leave his lungs. He looked at my face and then looked around the room at the venture capitalists and politicians who were bowing their heads slightly as I passed. The catastrophic truth hit him with the force of a freight train. The Phantom Development Project. The predatory loan. The anonymous chairman. It was all me. But Nia could not accept it. Her mind violently rejected the reality playing out in front of her. Her desperate, fragile ego shattered, triggering a massive, delusional defense mechanism. She broke away from her paralyzed family and stormed forward, her heels stomping aggressively against the marble. She shattered the dignified silence of the room with a shrill, frantic screech. She marched right up to the edge of the staircase, her face twisted in an ugly mask of rage and panic. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at my custom gown and screamed, demanding to know what kind of sick joke I was playing. She shrieked that I must have lost my mind. Her voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings, entirely devoid of class or restraint. She demanded to know how much money I had borrowed to rent this estate. She accused me of taking out massive fraudulent loans just to play dress-up for a day. She screamed that I was trying to put the entire family in debt just to cure my pathetic inferiority complex. The surrounding billionaires turned to stare at her with expressions of profound disgust. The mayor exchanged a baffled look with the state senator. They were looking at Naya as if she were a rabid animal that had somehow wandered into a high society gala. I stopped on the final step. Jaden stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between me and Nia, his eyes locked onto his aunt with a cold, lethal warning. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not even look at Nia. I treated her with the absolute ultimate form of disrespect. I completely ignored her existence. My eyes bypassed my shrieking sister entirely and locked onto the sweating, trembling man standing behind her. Preston was shaking so violently, his expensive suit jacket was vibrating. He looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner reach for the lever. The room was dead silent save for Nia's frantic panting. I looked directly into Preston's terrified eyes, and my voice cut through the grand foyer, crisp, cold, and echoing with absolute authority. Preston, I said, my tone devoid of any familial warmth. You are 15 minutes late for your appointment. The words dropped into the room like an anvil. Nia whipped her head around to look at her husband, her mouth open in a silent scream of confusion. Vivian and Arthur stared at Preston, waiting for him to correct me, waiting for him to demand respect, waiting for him to prove that he was the powerful corporate titan they believed him to be. But Preston did not speak. His knees finally buckled under the crushing weight of reality. He dropped his heavy leather briefcase. It hit the marble floor with a loud crack, popping open and spilling the federal tax liens and the default notices across the pristine white stone for everyone to see. He fell to his knees right in front of the entire assembly, his head bowing down in an involuntary display of total submission. He finally understood. I was not just the sister they had thrown away. I was the architect of his total annihilation. I was the chairman. I stepped off the final stair, my Oscar de la Renta gown sweeping elegantly past Nia, who was now standing frozen, her arms trembling at her sides. I walked past my parents without a single glance in their direction. I moved gracefully toward the end of the hall where Isaiah was waiting for me at the altar, looking handsome and entirely unbothered by the destruction unfolding behind me. I had invited them to a wedding, but they had arrived just in time for a funeral. Their own. The camera executes a sharp, aggressive rack focus, shifting rapidly between the absolute icy composure of my expression and the sickly pale horror melting across Preston's face. He stares at me as if I have just grown a second head. His mouth opens and closes like a suffocating fish. He shakes his head frantically, trying to force the pieces of his shattered reality back together. He chokes on his own breath, his voice a pathetic, cracked whisper as he asks what I'm talking about. I do not answer him immediately. I let the agonizing silence stretch, allowing the weight of the moment to crush the last remnants of his arrogance. From the gathered crowd of elite guests, my lead corporate counsel steps forward. Marcus moves with the quiet, lethal efficiency of a man accustomed to destroying corporate empires before lunch. He holds a thick, heavy manila folder. He does not offer it politely. He presses it directly flat against Preston's chest, forcing my brother-in-law to grab it instinctively just to stop it from hitting the floor. I look down at the man who has spent the last decade mocking my existence. My voice rings out across the grand, silent foyer, carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. I welcome him to my estate. I tell him to look around at the walls, the marble, the empire that I built with my own 2 hands, while they were busy treating me like dirt. Then I deliver the killing blow. I announce clearly for every billionaire politician and investor in the room to hear that in my official capacity, as the chairman and sole owner of Montgomery Holdings, I am formally rejecting his desperate plea for a corporate bailout. Preston physically recoils as if he has been shot. The heavy manila folder trembles violently in his hands. He tears it open, his desperate eyes scanning the legal documents, the embossed corporate seals, the irrefutable proof of my absolute ownership. Nia lets out a high-pitched, strangled noise. She violently shakes her head, her flawless bridal white gown rustling as she steps toward me. She screams that it is a lie. She insists that I am just a bakery worker, a pathetic charity case. She demands that Preston stop looking at those fake papers and tell everyone that I am a fraud. I shift my gaze from Preston to my sister. The coldness in my eyes stops her dead in her tracks. I do not raise my voice, but every word I speak is a blade designed to cut through her lifelong delusion. I thank her. I tell her I need to express my deepest, most profound gratitude for the relentless, greedy bullying she subjected me to last month. I remind her of the quitclaim deed she so eagerly forced me to sign. I explain that Uncle Henry's land was never a gold mine. It was a toxic liability. I watch the exact moment the realization begins to dawn on her. I explain that the land carried a massive federal environmental hazard penalty. Because she was so desperate to steal my inheritance, she legally assumed total financial responsibility for that disaster. I smile a razor-thin expression of total victory. I thank her for so willingly volunteering to shoulder the staggering federal tax lien on my behalf. I tell her the government does not care about her designer clothes or her country club status. They only care that her name is on the deed to a toxic wasteland. Preston lets out a horrific, guttural sound. He drops the folder, clutching his chest. I turn back to him, refusing to give him a single second to breathe. I tell him the nightmare is not over. I explain the anatomy of the $40 million loan he took out to save his failing firm. I explain that Apex Vanguard Capital, the shadow lender he thought was his salvation, was nothing more than a subsidiary shell company created by my acquisitions team. I was his lender. I was the one who approved his exorbitant interest rates. I was the one who engineered the phantom zoning project that baited him into leveraging everything he owned. I announce that his firm is officially bankrupt. I have already initiated the hostile takeover protocols. His assets are frozen, his accounts are drained, and his corporate reputation is permanently eradicated. I look between my sister and my brother-in-law, projecting the full terrifying magnitude of my power. I tell them that I have purchased every single one of their outstanding debts. I own their mortgage. I own their car notes. I own the very ground they walk on. Between the defaulted loans, the federal penalties, and the corporate seizures, they currently owe me exactly $8 million. Nia stops breathing. The arrogant sneer that she has worn since childhood completely vanishes, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She looks at Preston, begging him to fix it, demanding that he use his financial genius to save them. But Preston is already a ghost. He stares blankly at the marble floor, completely broken his mind, unable to process the total annihilation of his life. Nia's legs give out. Her knees hit the hard, polished stone with a sickening thud. The pristine white fabric of her $10,000 gown pools around her like a surrendered flag. She collapses onto the floor, her hands gripping her hair, as she finally understands that she has spent her entire life digging her own grave. She is bankrupt. She is publicly humiliated in front of the city's most elite society. She is entirely at my mercy. Vivian and Arthur stand frozen behind them. My mother covers her mouth with trembling hands, her face a portrait of devastating shock. The daughter she threw away, the child she called a failure, is standing before her as a billionaire titan, while her golden child weeps on the floor in absolute ruin. I look down at Nia, shivering at my feet. I feel no pity. I feel no guilt. I feel only the clean, absolute satisfaction of a war, perfectly executed. I reach out and place my hand on Jaden's shoulder. My son looks down at the people who once treated him like garbage, his posture radiating proud, quiet strength. He knows exactly who we are. I turn my back on the wreckage of their lives. I have a wedding to attend. The deafening silence that gripped the grand foyer was suddenly shattered by the sharp, frantic clicking of designer heels against marble. The camera focus shifts rapidly, blurring Preston's pale, catatonic face in the foreground and snapping sharply onto Vivian. My mother had just witnessed the absolute vaporization of her son-in-law's empire and the complete financial ruin of her golden child. But Vivian was a creature of parasitic survival. The realization that the daughter she had discarded was not merely successful, but commanded a multi-billion-dollar global syndicate triggered a desperate manic pivot in her psychology. She completely ignored Nia, who was still sobbing uncontrollably on the floor in her ruined $10,000 white gown. She bypassed Arthur, who was clutching his chest as he realized his entire retirement portfolio was locked inside a bankrupt hedge fund. Vivian lunged forward, her silver dress swishing wildly as she chased after me. She cried out my name, her voice pitching into a shrill, theatrical wail designed to garner sympathy from the surrounding elite. She reached out her hands, trembling, grasping at the air just inches from my custom Oscar de la Renta train. She wept, insisting that she always knew I was brilliant. She sobbed that she was so incredibly proud of the woman I had become. Her face twisted into a mask of pathetic begging as she pleaded with me to stop this. She cried that we were blood, that we were a family, and that I absolutely could not do this to my own sister. The camera cuts to a tight, intimate close-up of Vivian's face, capturing every drop of her manufactured grief, every line of her desperate greed. Then the focus snaps sharply back to me. I stop walking. I turn around slowly, the heavy silk of my gown cascading flawlessly around my feet. The entire pavilion holds its collective breath. The venture capitalists, the state senators, and the media moguls watch in absolute stillness. I raise one single manicured hand. The gesture is slight, but it carries the undeniable weight of an absolute sovereign. Vivian freezes instantly, her outstretched hands hovering in the empty space between us. My eyes are entirely devoid of anger or sorrow. They are as cold and unyielding as glacial ice. Family, I repeat the word, tasting bitter and foreign on my tongue. I look at the woman who gave birth to me, analyzing her not as a daughter looking at a mother, but as an apex predator observing a cornered liability. Family are the people who pulled out a chair for me and offered me a warm meal when my own biological mother threw me onto the street in the freezing rain on Thanksgiving night. I state my voice echoing with crystal-clear precision through the cavernous foyer. Family are the people who held my son when he cried, who built me up when I had nothing, who stood by my side while you spent a decade treating me like a contagious disease. Vivian flinches violently as if I have physically struck her. She opens her mouth to offer another pathetic excuse, but I cut her off completely. You are not my family. I declare the finality of the statement, sealing her fate forever. You are nothing but uninvited guests trespassing in my home.